This week, Prime Minister Trudeau gave his first address to the United Nations. It was a speech noted for its soaring tones, lofty aspirations, and some pointed rebukes. But did it accomplish anything? Joining us now on that, in Ottawa, John Ivison, political columnist at the National Post. And here in studio, Bessma Momani, professor at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and the University of Waterloo, and senior fellow at CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And Darren Thorne is here, adjunct professor at the Osgoode Hall Law School, and it's good to see you three back here, both in our studio in Toronto and the nation's capital. Let's just play a little snippet of the PM at the UN, and we'll come back and chat. Sheldon.
We believe we should confront anxiety with a clear plan to deal with its root causes. Because what is the alternative? To exploit anxiety? To turn it into fear and blame? To reject others because they look or speak or pray differently than we do? You see, in Canada, we got a very important thing right. Not perfect, but right. In Canada, we see diversity as a source of strength, not weakness.
Justin Trudeau at the United Nations. Bessma, to you first. In your view, what was the point of his speech?
Well, I think it was an uplifting speech and a welcomed one. Usually that room is empty, so the fact that you see some heads is quite an achievement on that. And he is a rock star internationally. People want to hear what he has to say, and I think he came with a very positive message that the world needs right now. We need to hear something positive because, frankly, our news sets are just full of continuous bad news, rising racism, xenophobia, and these populist leaders coming from the right that seem to be scaring a lot of us moderate, progressive people. And really, I think we all want to hear a good story to tell. And I think he achieved what he went in there for, which was to really tell us about Canada.
PM thinks he's got a good story to tell, Darren, but my question to you will be more about the location in which he told that story. The former Conservative Foreign Minister John Baird called the United Nations a debating club for dictators. So how useful was it for Mr. Trudeau to push the Canadian brand to that audience?
Oh, I think it was useful. Not only was it useful, I think, quite frankly, it's necessary if we want to be able to use the machinery of the United Nations and the multilateral system to try and achieve our goals at the public international level. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Canada's international standing had really taken a hit in recent years. I mean, we're not North Korea, we're not an international pariah, but by and large, we did have just a couple of strong allies, and most everyone else would sort of quietly ignore us. So, at the end of the day, that doesn't work for us because we're not the U.S. We don't have their military power. We're not China. We don't have their economic power. What we are is a prosperous sort of middle power which needs these sort of multilateral institutions, or we need to devise something else we can use in their place if we're actually going to get things done. So, it's fair, and in fact, it's good to criticize the UN. I've worked with them periodically. There's lots to criticize. But if you're seen as criticizing in kind of an empty way and not really being engaged with the organization, you're not going to be able to go anywhere. And let me just put it this way. Be it in the halls of the UN or at any of our workplaces, nobody likes that person in the corner who's just complaining and doesn't seem to be interested in working to get things done. And that was really the perception of Canada.
We've invited John Ivison to be on the program tonight to be the curmudgeon of our discussion, because here's how he described the Trudeau speech in the National Post. The speech was as thin as soup made from the carcass of a starving pigeon. Trudeau's pitch about focusing on what brings us together rather than on what divides us is yesterday's news in Canada, but for a General Assembly audience from whom Trudeau hopes to extricate a Security Council seat, it is fresh fare. John, in which case, what kind of meat do you think the PM should have put in the soup that would have helped Canada with its mission to get a seat on that Security Council?
Well, to be fair, I also said it was mission accomplished at the end of it. I think the wonder was, though, that he didn't give this speech dressed in red serge. It was a campaign speech. It was designed, I think, to improve Canada's standing with a view to getting a seat on the Security Council when the vote comes in 2019. Some of the stuff that I think that he could have said, which we heard the person who immediately was immediately before him, Theresa May, started talking about UN reform, about deployment of UK troops in South Sudan and Somalia. I think the initial plan of the Trudeau government was to make an announcement on a deployment in Africa at the UN. I think that plan came off the rails once the defence minister went to Africa and found out that it was exactly as helter-skelter in places like Mali as he'd been led to believe. So that announcement is still pending. But it was a campaign speech, and it really wasn't about what he said. It was about how he made the delegates feel, and by and large, they emerged feeling good about Canada and particularly about Justin Trudeau.
And thus, as your column pointed out at the very end, mission accomplished, yes?
I think from their point of view, I mean, we're slightly jaded, curmudgeonly, cynical, because we'd heard much of this speech before, because he used the diversity is strength line so many times in the election campaign, and this had a very similar feel to it.
Let's hear a little bit more, because the PM did spend about a third of his time at the podium talking about the Syrian refugee situation. So let's hear some on that, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
In recent months, Canadians have opened their hearts and their arms to families fleeing the ongoing conflict in Syria. And from the moment they arrived, those 31,000 refugees were welcomed not as burdens, but as neighbors and friends, as new Canadians.
Pause for applause, which eventually came. Are you at all concerned that our Prime Minister got up there and looked a little bit too self-congratulatory for his own good in an audience of people that may not want to hear how wonderful Canada is and how not wonderful the rest of you are?
Well, I think the people, people in the audience do want to hear about Canada and what we've done. But, the thing is, talking about 31,000, that pales in comparison to all of the neighboring countries. Jordan and Lebanon each have taken over 1 million. Turkey, of course, even more than that. And we have, of course, the 1 million that are making their way into Europe as well. So it's just really kind of a little awkward that he's talking about 31,000, which is a really small number. Again, it was a lot for us. And compared to our American friends, of course, it's a huge amount more than them when they've taken about 1,200. So, for a country that's 10 times our size, we're doing well in our continent. But, again, for those that are in the neighborhood and in Europe, maybe saying the number was not going to be very impressive.
It is fair to say Canada's doing, pound for pound, as you like, pretty well compared to a lot of other countries, isn't it?
Well, certainly, as you just said, compared to the United States, they've got 10 times our population, are the world's biggest economy. Their response has really been somewhat pathetic. Mm-hmm. And as you said, you could contrast it on the other hand to say Germany, which has taken in hundreds of thousands of refugees. But I think it's fair to point out that, Germany is experiencing some problems as a result of this. There's been a bit of a backlash. But I think the one thing maybe that we need to keep in mind, and that people seem to sometimes lose sight of when we talk abstractly about refugees, is what a refugee actually is. Like, a refugee essentially is a person who has been brought about as low as a human being can possibly be. Their communities have been destroyed, their friends and family have been killed, they've been displaced, they're often on the point of starvation and are living in abject poverty and misery. So I just think, given that, I think it speaks well of us and any nation that tries to rise to the occasion to try and alleviate some of that suffering. And it obviously plays well, and so we can extol the virtues of it before the UN, as we were just doing there. But beyond that, as a matter of basic human decency, this is something that I think, and I think most people think, we should be doing.
John, in terms of commitments, did Prime Minister Trudeau come bearing any hard news to that UN audience?
Well, he didn't mention it so much in his speech, but the day before there were some details on some of the spending that had already been committed in the budget. There was $1.6 billion committed in the budget for Iraq and Syria without it being particularly earmarked for anything. So I think about 500,000 of that, 500 million of that money was earmarked for specific causes on the day before the speech was given. There was a little bit more money specifically for education of people in refugee camps. And he committed to raising our humanitarian aid budget by 10% next year. So there were some specifics that preceded the speech. I think generally well received. It tied in with the broader themes of inclusivity, income equality, all the diversity of strength message that he was selling in the UN speech.
Bessma, as you pointed out, part of the branding of this is to emphasize, the Prime Minister wants to, we're Canadian, we're here to help. That's obviously a big part of his and this country's brand under his leadership. How does the collapse of the Syrian ceasefire play into any of that, though?
Well, I don't think very much. I mean, we haven't really been very active on this file. But, of course, I think many people are, again, watching the news and seeing not a single good news story. I mean, it wasn't, I think, a coincidence that the ceasefire broke down during the UN General Assembly meetings. But, of course, for Trudeau, I think he wants to change the conversation a little bit about Canada being this beacon of hope somehow. He talked about this world anxiety and fear, and often much of the debate in Europe has been, I think, taken over by this argument that somehow the rise of terror, et cetera, is really related to the refugee crisis, which I think is a dubious link, but one that obviously, understandably, plays into the fear and anxiety of people there, particularly in Germany at the moment. So I think that he was really trying to make something clear about Canada, not just, I think, playing a new and important role on the world stage, because this is a speech and attempt to rebrand Canada, right? I mean, we've had 9 years of the Harper government, as you noted, and as the quote from Baird noted, which was, Harper was not seen as a person that actually had any respect for the United Nations, and people at the UN knew that. So this was an attempt to say, we're back, the sort of old Canadian liberal internationalist perspective is back again, and I'm going to deliver a speech of hope and opportunity here, and I think it went really well.
Okay, Darren, having said that, Canada has not made what you would call any kind of robust military commitment to trying to assist matters in Syria, and I wonder how that plays with a United Nations audience that might have been looking for more.
Well, it depends on the subset of the audience. I mean, there's certainly some, in the United Nations, in that audience, that would want Canada to be participating more. On the other hand, those kind of military incursions, particularly when led by Western countries in certain regions, really do tend to carry a bit of a stigma for certain other countries. And so the fact that we're not engaged, it's hard to say that inactivity is really a good thing in any sort of way, but at the very least it gets us away from that kind of stigma. And frankly, it's sort of a return, as Bessma had pointed out, to what Canada's role was before, which was to say that we didn't emphasize the military role. We tended to play up the soft power aspects of things. We wanted to be the honest broker people would talk to. And also we'd be involved in peacekeeping. Now, the former government obviously thought, and was quite frank in saying that this was a really feckless policy in their opinion, and so as a result, they tried to bolster our military wing in terms of these engagements. But the fact of the matter is that the hard truth is we are not a major military power on the world stage. There has not been a Canadian government in recent history which has put the resources into our military to ensure that that is so. And if we're not actually doing that, there's a question about just how much utility we can have as a military player.
I don't want to get off the path here too much, but would you say the Canadian commitment to Kandahar and Afghanistan was not a significant, serious military commitment?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I'm saying is just taken as a whole in terms of what we tend to put into the military as a country. And this includes the Harper government as well as many others. So certainly they increased the levels, but if you sort of look at it, were we really a military power that would be able to move the needle truly significantly? I'm not trying to be insulting to the military because they do the job which is put before them, and they do it very well. But at the end of the day, the question is, if you look at, for example, Syria right now, and that quagmire, if we were to add our military strength to that, would it really move things along in any significant way?
You're convinced not.
Well, I think it's hard to say that it would, mostly because of the conflict that they're in. So I guess the question is maybe we might be better off in rerouting our resources to more of this kind of a soft power approach afterwards.
Let me try this, John.
It's a difficult question.
Okay, John, let me try this with you as a follow-up. I know you're not a huge fan of the United Nations, having described it in one of your pieces as, quote, wildly inefficient. So if the Prime Minister of Canada wants to be more involved in that organization, maybe help reform it, maybe help be a bigger player there, have you got some advice for him?
Well, I think that they're doing the right thing by getting involved, but we've got a new Secretary General coming at the start of next year. Well, obviously, we don't know who that is yet. I think if we do get on the Security Council or we become more involved by dint of supplying more resource, there are definitely things that need to be done. I mean, there was a former senior bureaucrat in the UN, Anthony Bambury, wrote in the New York Times quite recently that the UN is a Remington typewriter in a smartphone world. I mean, there are plenty of areas where, and Ban Ki-moon in his speech at the UN apologized for the behavior of UN peacekeepers in I think it was in Central African Republic. They came from the Democratic Republic of Congo and were accused of terrible human rights atrocities. But beyond that, you know, Banbury's, for example, suggests that admin costs as a percentage of operation costs be limited. He suggests that the personnel system be blown up. He suggests that there be audits of effectiveness. You know, John Bolton, the former US ambassador to the UN, once said that you could remove the top 10 floors of the UN building and nobody would notice. Well, a former Canadian diplomat said to me he would estimate that at 20 floors. When you go in there, it's a little rabbit hole. It's an autonomous area of New York that seems to operate under a different language, an acronym-laden language. There is huge inefficiency you can see with the naked eye. And I think that there were reasons why Harper was less than enthusiastic about the UN. Let's put it that way. Although I would take issue with the idea that we were absent the UN because, as you point out, we were in Afghanistan and that was a UN mission. Harper became very enthusiastic about the maternal and child health initiative, which was another UN-sponsored project. So it's not fair to say we were away entirely, and I think the Liberal government realised the sort of self-congratulatory nature of saying we're back, and that was kind of downplayed latterly. Trudeau didn't say we're back. So in short, there is a lot that could be done to reform it, and you know, Winston Churchill once said, "We didn't set up the UN to get us to heaven. We set it up to save us from hell." And I think that in that spirit, Trudeau's intervention should be welcomed, and I think he should use whatever increased leverage he has to improve the place.
Seems a month doesn't go by when I don't hear another fabulous quote from Winston Churchill. He really was the gold standard on this stuff. Bessma, you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Darren. You know, we're not going to be this military superpower, but we're not about quantity, we're about quality. And we do these sort of boutique kinds of projects, you know. So, for example, in the fight against ISIL, you know, our goal there is to really help train the Kurdish Peshmerga. And we do that well. We have 300 people on the ground to train this force. We're not trying to train the entire Iraqi army. We choose a very small project. But the Kurdish Peshmerga have been very successful in liberating a great deal of territory with a great deal of cohesion. We don't need to put, you know, 25 airplanes in the skies. We had 6 in the way. I think it was a smart decision to finally remove those because in the big scheme of things, they weren't making the big impact on the ground. But the last thing too is, I mean, back to our sort of Canadian brand, peacekeeping, which by the way, we all agree in terms of our collective memory is an important part of what makes us Canadian. Well, we were doing a pretty dismal job on that. You know, 65 placed in the world in terms of those countries that commit troops. Pakistan, Bangladesh, all of these countries far exceed our contribution.
Well, we basically got out of it.
Absolutely. And so I think that this re-engagement and thinking about peacekeeping, and of course we need to assess where we're going to send our soldiers. It's not going to be a perfect place because otherwise peacekeepers won't be there. Mm-hmm. And I think eventually ramping that up is something that actually moves us away from that, I think, you know, all talk and no action, and to bring back muscle where we can do it. And again, in these very boutique, selective issue areas where we can make some progress.
Darren.
Yeah, and
can I just leap in there? One thing that struck me about that, though, is that you know the Canadian military is obviously limited, as everybody has mentioned, and there's only a certain amount of resource that can be diverted anywhere. We are not diverting that resource towards NATO, of which we're a partner, and our contribution is at less than 1%, whereas countries like Poland and Greece and the UK are all over 2%, and we have committed to 2%. And yet, rather than ramp up our NATO commitment, we have diverted resource to the UN. And I think that, you know, that may or may not be a good thing, but I don't think that debate is being had.
Darren, a follow-up.
Yeah, a couple of things. One on just the question of the UN's inefficiency. Yes, absolutely, the UN can be hugely inefficient. On the other hand, you look at the situation, the reality of it. You're dealing with an organization with 193 member states, essentially 193 governing minds who all have different views, different opinions, different goals, and act in their own self-interest first before the interest of the international community. Mm-hmm. Add to that they're trying to become involved in pretty well every significant major problem at the international level facing the human race, and then they have thousands upon thousands of employees. Well, big surprise that they're going to be a huge, monolithic, lumbering, somewhat inefficient organization. I don't think we should just simply tolerate that or let it pass under the bridge, but I think we have to acknowledge the reality of it and recognize that if we're going to try and reform it, and in fact the UN does need reform, there's no argument with respect to that, It's a matter of being involved in the first place, having the cachet within the organization for people to think we're a contributing partner, where then we can build those alliances and hopefully take a real leadership role.
Let me jump in here while you've got the floor, because we're down to our last few minutes here, and I do want to get you on this, which is whenever a major political figure gives a speech anywhere, there are always multiple audiences. Obviously, the people who are in the hall are one audience. Obviously, the audience back home, the Canadian people, is another audience. Is there another audience besides that for Justin Trudeau's speech?
Well, this one I really do believe in some ways was reaching out to the world. And I just think that at this particular moment in history, and Bessma kind of had referred to this earlier, we're looking at this rising tide of racial hostility, of racial tensions, of xenophobia, of anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment, which seems to be sort of sweeping the world. It's certainly very prevalent in the election campaign down south. We saw the impact that it had in the Brexit vote, and you're hearing some pretty disturbing things coming out of capitals in Europe with respect to the refugees and these issues. So I think in that particular moment, in this particular moment in history, it's actually a good thing to have a nation standing up and extolling the virtues of diversity. And we have to recognize that while we hear this all the time, and it might be passé for us because we hear it all the time and people might get bored of hearing it here, not everyone in the world hears anything resembling that. And so it's nice to have a counter-narrative that's being put out there.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for the other side, though, Bessma, and that is, if this speech was in some respects directed towards people who might want to support Donald Trump in November, does anybody have a problem with a Canadian leader trying to put his thumb on the scale in a U.S. election? Is that problematic at all?
I really don't think Trump supporters are listening to UN speeches, frankly. To be quite honest.
That's a good point.
But, you know, I think that, look, let's keep in mind here that the question really is coming to the question of whether or not he's doing this for a domestic audience here in Canada. And the truth of the matter is, Canadians don't vote on foreign policy. They don't vote on that issue. We know that. That's been repeatedly researched and well documented in polls. So this was for the audience of the UN, for the world. And I have to say, I mean, he is extremely popular around the world. I mean, I can't help but I travel quite a bit to the Middle East in particular. People love him.
They know him?
Oh,
they know Justin Trudeau as
absolutely.
Canada's Prime Minister.
Oh, I can show you women in the villages of the Middle East who show me videos of his wonderful speeches during Eid, during Ramadan. He is well liked and respected around the world. I've seen that in trips to Poland, in trips to Europe, in trips to South America. People want to hear this. And I think it's absolutely, as Darren said, this is blasé and we think that this happens all the time, but they hear far more Trump. And when someone like Trudeau stands up, people finally have a good feeling about their lives, because we are living in a time of anxiety and fear where people like Geert Wilders and others are standing up and saying the most racist and incredibly mean things that frankly have become too common there. I mean, it's become now normal language to talk about hating Muslims, to talk about hating minorities, to talk about these things. And I think it's really a fresh air that we all need.
John, let me get you to weigh in on that insofar as certainly that side of the political spectrum appears to be in ascension at the moment. Can a speech at the United Nations by the Prime Minister of Canada do anything to counteract some of that?
I think it can. You know, I interviewed Stephane Dion on Wednesday, and he said Trudeau's now the most popular political figure in the world. And he might be right on that. What he said, the material manifestation of that, is that world leaders are coming to Trudeau to appeal to whoever comes next in the US to maintain the US's multilateralism. They see Canada as having a special relationship with the US, and Trudeau in particular as being somebody who could carry that message to the next president, even to Donald Trump. So I think, yeah, I mean, this appearance was perhaps not lacking, perhaps lacking in some substance as far as specifics. And you know, I think one of the other, you asked me about what meat should have been in there. I think, for example, he should have talked about the attack on the UN convoy in Aleppo, for example, given that he was talking about Syria. But it was not totally without worth. I mean, I think that things were achieved, and Trudeau's standing in the world was bolstered as a result. I think that he is now an important figure on the global scene. We've seen that with the Chinese coming calling. That's now building into a special relationship. You know, this guy is rising on the world scene. Amazing for a guy who a year ago there were millions of dollars of ads on television saying he's not ready for the job. We'll see. Maybe he is.
Thanks, everybody, for this discussion on TVO tonight. John Ivison of the National Post in our nation's capital, Bessma Momani from CG, Darren Thorne from the Osgoode Hall Law School. Thanks, everybody.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.